It is my personal feeling the basic problem was the prejudice of the commanding general at that time. He literally believed, and he said it in public, a Jap's a Jap, and there's no way that a piece of paper is going to make him any different. It was literally a prison camp. There were armed MPs patrolling the perimeter. A detachment of military police are, of course, assigned to each of these assembly centers. Any person with 1/16th Japanese blood would be subject to these orders. There was no exception. People in hospitals and sanitarium were dragged out and put on the train and shipped out. You know, this is crazy. The military should have no authority to deal with the civilian population unless you're going to come in as a conquering hero or something. But, you know, this is the way dictators start, that the military feel that they can control the civilian population. And certainly it is not consonant with our American principle. Imagine living for 40 years not knowing where your wife was, where your children were buried. You know, those are the kind of things that came out.
After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was a surge in national unity, a feeling of great confidence in the U.S. government. Public support remained high throughout the war. It was as if the government could do no wrong. In the spring of 1942, over 110,000 men, women, and children were driven from their homes and placed in internment camps. Most had one thing in common. They were Japanese Americans. This is a story of one of these Japanese Americans, the story of Minoru Yasui and his struggle for justice. Since the day Min Yasui was picked up for relocation to an internment camp, he's been fighting the federal government's treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Yasui talks about the Japanese American experience before the 1940s. The Oriental Exclusion Act refers to the Immigration Act of 1924, designed to stop the immigration of Japanese laborers.
Basically, what we're talking about prior to 1940 is the influx of Chinese laborers 150 years ago. We're really talking about the 1830s and 1840s. Unfortunately, because of the anti-Oriental movement, the Yellow Peril scares and so on, by 1882 the Congress of the United States prohibited the importation of Chinese laborers from China. In order to fill that gap, American labor contractors went to Japan and prevailed upon the Japanese government to start sending laborers, particularly from southern Japan. This labor movement began probably during the 1890s and continued, of course, until the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924. By 1924, there were probably 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, as well as an equal number of about 120,000 in the islands of Hawaii. However, we inherited, of course, the antipathy towards persons of Asian background, and as a consequence, prior to 1940, there was not only legislative and legal restrictions against persons of Asian background, but the whole society did not accept the Asian, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and Filipinos on an equal footing. There is no question that the Chinese laborers filled a very needed gap in the labor supply in California. I have read statistics back in 1849 that 25% of the miners in California were of Chinese background. Certainly the railroad laborers that punched through the transcontinental railroad up Feather River Canyon across the Sierra Nevadas or Chinese laborers. No question that they fulfilled a very definite need. The problem, of course, became when the labor demands were not as great, and the Chinese labor or even the Japanese laborers later would come off the railroads or indeed out of the mines and start their own businesses and compete with the white American society that they were felt to be a threat. When we refer in the Japanese vernaculars, Issei, E being first, is the first generation Japanese who was born in Japan but first came to this country, the United States. The Nisei, second generation, refers to the first generation that was born in this country.
And you're a Nisei.
I'm a Nisei. Sansei, third generation, would be the children of the Nisei. It's not quite accurate, but that's the way in which the terms are used. Issei, born in Japan. Nisei, born in the United States. Sansei, the children of those born in the United States. Then when you get to Yonsei, Gosei, you get lost. So they begin to refer to the people of Japanese ancestry in the United States as Nikkei, but that's a new term. Upon the news that Pearl Harbor had happened, there was almost stunned disbelief that this could have possibly happened. For a period of 2 or 3 weeks, there was a buildup of real revulsion, real bitterness, because the United States suffered tremendous losses. There were 1,100 men below the decks of the battleship Arizona that lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. There was a sudden feeling that we have really been devastated. Consequently, as news, particularly from the Far East, start coming in, there were acts of violence against persons of Japanese ancestry. Indeed, in many of the small localities, the city councils began to revoke licenses possessed by persons of Japanese ancestry. There were indeed violations of contracts. As a practicing attorney, we found it very difficult to protect the rights of a person of Japanese ancestry at that particular time. There's no question that there were difficult problems arising.
Were people looking for scapegoats?
That is a part of the answer. Certainly the economic reasons also played a strong part in it. The economic reason being that many of the Japanese controlled rich farmlands which they had dug out from the swamps or the badlands of California. There's no question that they had control of much of the vegetable industry, the flour industry, and so on. And there were people who were selfish and greedy trying to take over these kinds of interests. There is, in addition thereto, the political aspects. The politicians of California, certainly Washington and Oregon, used this as a convenient bandwagon, a very popular one, in order to get elected and re-elected. You know, this kind of thing certainly happened. However, it is my personal feeling the basic problem was the prejudice of the commanding general at that time. He literally believed, and he said it in public, a Jap's a Jap, and there's no way that a piece of paper is going to make him any different. He just simply didn't have faith in democracy. He didn't have a fundamental belief that liberty and justice is in the entitlement of all persons. He was a military person, and he was going to distinguish between people on the basis of ancestry. Then, of course, the fault lies with our political leaders, our national political leaders. And I would fault the President of the United States because he failed to consider taking away the limited rights of a small group endangers the rights of all people, because if it can be done to us, they could do it to anyone, to all people. And that, I think, is part of the real tragedy of what happened in 1942. In regard to our particular family, my father was first picked up during December, and he was shipped off to an internment camp in Missoula, Montana. My mother and 2 younger brothers were shipped down to, first of all, Pinedale, and thereafter to Tule Lake. I, being an attorney in Portland, they shipped me off to Minidoka. That's one thing that had happened, that the so-called potential community leaders were separated. In Seattle, we know that we had 3 attorneys. Kenji Ito was sent down to Poston, Arizona, so he would not be together with Tom Masuda, who was in Minidoka, and the third attorney was sent to Wyoming. You know, they did that as a deliberate policy. Generally speaking, however, they did not split members of a family. But I personally was first of all put into the North Portland Assembly Center, which was a livestock barn, and from there in September we were shipped out to Minidoka, Idaho. One of the hardest things, though, is that, you know, they load us on these darn trains and they pull the blinds. You don't know where you're going or how long it's going to take or how long you're going to be there. And the rumors that were flying were really amazing because, you know, they're going to take all these Niseis and separate them and let all the Niseis become farm laborers, or they're going to use the Japanese Americans as hostages for the prisoners of war, and they're going to put us in prisoner of war camps. The rumors were rife, and none of them were true, but except for the fact that we were indeed going to a camp and had to stay there. The unfortunate thing is that it was a military order based upon ancestry, and Colonel Carl Bendetson ruled that any person with 1/16th Japanese blood would be subject to these orders. There was no exception. People in hospitals and sanitarium were dragged out and put on the train and shipped out. You know, this is crazy. Orphans were actually shipped out. There was a ruling that if the child was under the age of 18 and residing with a non-Japanese family, they may remain. There was a further ruling, and I forgot specifically, in regard to certain kinds of invalids could be detained for a certain period and then shipped out. But we also know that there were radio operators working for the United States military intelligence who were stationed on the West Coast, and we have reports that some of these were remaining on the West Coast. But otherwise, on the West Coast, all persons of Japanese ancestry subject to military orders were shipped out. Then we go to Hawaii, 2,000 miles closer to the enemy, and indeed where the attack actually took place, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. There they did not have mass evacuation. To the best of my knowledge, about 1,500 Japanese Americans were selectively shipped over to the West Coast and put into camps. There were another about 400 who were put into camps in the island of Maui and certainly on the island of Oahu at Honouliuli. But these were done on a very selective basis. The actual camps were dreary affairs, and obviously you're doing it under an emergency situation. Starting in about March, the United States Army requisitioned supplies and so on and built approximately 19 assembly centers. They were called assembly centers because people were being brought in, temporarily housed, and thereafter moved out. But from a period of about April, May, June, they forced people into horse barns, racetracks, fairgrounds, temporary shelters built out in farmland. I know it was not intended to be permanent, so the facilities were rather primitive. To give you an example, in Portland, Oregon, the actual accommodations were in the horse stalls and the cow stalls, and there one horse stall would house a family, another horse stall would house another family, and you had some 6,000 people under those conditions. Tanforan, the same kind of thing happened. They were quartering the people in stables. Sure, they calcimined the walls and they put asphalt on the ground, but, you know, these are horse stalls and there's no getting away with it. In Santa Anita, because they put in about 30,000 people, the stalls alone were not sufficient. So in the, what they call the foreground or the, whatever, the racetrack, they built temporary shelters made out of wood, and these were just shacks. And for a period from about May until September, they were confined in such places. The crowning indignity, of course, was the barbed wire fence around all of these establishments, man-proof, 8 feet high. They had the watchtowers, machine guns, sandbag. They had the searchlight playing lights at night up and down the barbed wire fence so no one can get in or out. It was literally a prison camp. There were armed MPs patrolling the perimeter. A detachment of military police are, of course, assigned to each of these assembly centers. During September, they started the movement out of the assembly centers into the 10 more permanent camps that are being built in the interior of the United States. There were 2 in California at Tule Lake, 1 at Manzanar. There's 2 in Arizona at Poston and Gila River, one in Idaho, Minidoka, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in the state of Utah, Grenada. Then there were two in Arkansas on the river bottoms of the Arkansas River. They were Jerome and Rower. But those camps, again, were the same type of enclosures with barbed wire fences, and again the machine guns, the jeep patrols, the armed sentries patrolling them. The block arrangements were something like 10 buildings to each block, 120 feet long, 20 feet wide, and they would partition them. For example, a 6-foot partition would house a husband and wife, a 20-foot partition would house a family of 5 or 6 kids. These residential sections surrounded then a core with 2 buildings. One building, again built of wood, was the lavatory for the washing, for the washrooms, the showers, and the toilet facilities, of course. The other building in the center would be the mess hall and the kitchen, so that the people, although they slept in the barracks, during their morning washing and so on, they get up and wash and shower, then go over to the mess hall to eat. Now that was the physical arrangement. And I guess the most difficult problem, particularly in the desert area, when we went there in September, the winds would blow and you'd get this dust. They were using raw lumber, obviously, because we didn't have a great deal of supplies on hand. And the lumber, of course, as they dried in the desert heat, would start to crack. And you get dust flowing into the living quarters. You'd have dust on your face and your ears, your nose, your eyes, and your clothes, and the food. That was the thing that permeated everything. Then, of course, as winter came on, it became pretty cold, and people were chinking the cracks that happened. And you have to imagine yourself in a square box, one light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The interior, of course, is not insulated. It's the raw 2x4 studs with planks on the outside covered with black tar paper. No tables, no chairs. They had an iron cot for each individual, a single iron cot. They gave us a mattress, army blankets, and that was it. In order to have a table or a chair, you scrounged lumber, scrap lumber. And boy, we liberated a lot of lumber from crates and so on, making your tables and making a little bit more livable. I think the primary thing that I would point out, America being America, the civilian directors of these camps tried in every possible way to make it as humane as possible. Milton Eisenhower was the first director, and he certainly believed that these people should not be kept in camp forever. Dillon Meyer became the successor after about a year, and Dillon Meyer came out of the Department of Interior. He'd worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he believed that if we leave people under those dependent circumstances for too long, then you would allow a reservation mentality to develop. So he encouraged anyone who could find a job, a school to go to leave as soon as possible. The issues became issues of life and death. We had the problem, of course, the military in 1943, opening up the draft and volunteering to the 442nd. Certain young people, because they believed in America and wanted to prove their loyalty, would volunteer. Fathers in internment camp, the mothers in one of the relocation centers, who's going to take care of the family. You know, these kinds of problems arose. I can still remember at the Federal Correctional Institute, an 18-year-old kid, Joe Massaoka and I were there saying to these young people, don't violate the conscription requirements because you're going to put a criminal record on your life, and certainly it's not going to help your mother and sister. And this kid would grip the bars and tears would be coming down his eyes, and he says, look, my father's in a camp someplace in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My mother's alone at Grenada. We have a 14-year-old sister. Who's going to take care of them if I go off to war? You know, you can't answer some of these questions. Other cases, I know in Tule Lake, the father would determine that there's no hope or future for him here in America, so he would opt to be repatriated to Japan. His wife obviously generally had to stay with the family. If there's children, the children were committed because of the decision of the father. If the family had children over the age of 18, those people would make up their own decisions. you would have tremendous family consequences. There's going to be quarrels, but the consequences were enormous because the Gripsholm did sail to Japan during the war, and they took about 1,500 so-called repatriates to Japan, and many of these young people, especially the children under the age of 18, had no desire whatsoever to go to Japan. America was the only country they ever knew, and yet because their father or their mother or relative insisted they go, they went.
In the camps, the prisoners were able to help themselves because they already had a strong foothold in American society.
Make no mistake, we were able to help ourselves because we had the doctors, the dentists. We didn't have all the supplies, we didn't have all the equipment, and our nurses were crying because, they couldn't get formula for babies, but they substituted and somehow got by. No, it isn't really the complaint about the inhuman treatment, and I think about the Holocaust in Germany. That's horrible, that's unspeakable. They were destroying human beings. The United States didn't do that. I'm talking about literally the damage that is done to our whole concept of the American democracy, to our whole country. That's really what concerns us, because this country, for all its faults, is still the best hope of all of humanity, it seems to me. We believe in justice and freedom for all people, because if we don't have freedom for all people, none of us will have it. That kind of a concept we have to keep pounding, it seems to me.
Yasui says, regardless of ethnic background, a person should be considered innocent until proven guilty.
I would go back to the Internal Security Act of 1952, wherein the law provided that if the Attorney General believed that an individual might endanger the security of the United States, that individual, without warrant, without charges, could be interned temporarily and detained. The Act further provided that if the disclosure of the charges would endanger, it was so sensitive that it would endanger the security, you wouldn't have to disclose even the nature of the charges. And that brings back certainly a melancholy resemblance to what happened back in 1942. And again, I would point out, in the case of the Iranian students, the hostages were kept in Tehran, and consequently the Iranian students were under a great deal of pressure to report to the immigration authorities, whereas our concept really should be that if the student does something wrong, he certainly should be subject to deportation and, if necessary, incarceration. But we've got this kind of mentality yet existing in our country, and this is why we feel that so far as the Japanese-American internment is concerned, that ought to be corrected.
What was your reason for violating the law?
Very specifically, the order was that the general ordered persons of Japanese ancestry to remain within their homes after the hours of 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning. It was my position that a military person has no authority to give orders to any civilian, unless that civilian is in the army, in which case it would no longer be a civilian. But the point is that the military should have no authority to deal with the civilian population unless they're going to come in as a conquering hero or something. But, this is the way dictators start, that the military feel that they can control the civilian population. And certainly it is not consonant with our American principles. Secondly, I felt that as an American citizen, where there's any abuses, it's the obligation and duty of an American citizen to really test whether or not it is proper. We have the courts of law open. We certainly are permitted to address these matters actually in court. So this is really the motivation which motivated me to move in this direction. In 1943, the Army decided that those individuals who could pass a loyalty test could volunteer for the United States Army for infantry combat with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. As a part of that determination of loyalty, they had a questionnaire, your name, your age, your education, and so on. But question number 27 very specifically asked, would you be willing to serve in the armed forces, the United States Army Armed Forces, on combat duty wherever sent? Now, the military, of course, are interested in males over the age of 18. But bureaucracy being bureaucracy, somehow the WRA applied that to everyone. And that's stupid, because here a grandpa 70 years old or grandma 60 years old is getting a question saying, are you willing to serve on armed combat with the United States Armed Forces? That's ridiculous. They were giving it to girls, 18 and older. And, it was really a very bad judgment on the part of the administration. But question number 28 was even worse. The question started out very, very well. It says, would you pledge unqualified allegiance to the United States of America? And every person who is an American citizen perfectly willing to say yes. But it went on further with a comma, and forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. I asked myself, holy smokes, I never owed any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. If I answer that yes, I'm forswearing allegiance that I never owed, admitting that I did owe it. If I say no, then I'm saying I won't be loyal to the United States. You're in a catch-22 situation. So many people qualified their answers, but the administration wanted a yes, yes, or a no, no. You couldn't qualify your answers. And the other stupid thing that happened, our parent generation, these say, were barred by law from becoming citizens of the United States. And you hand this questionnaire to a Japanese Issei national, citizen of Japan, and say, will you swear on qualified allegiance to the United States and forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, means that he's a person without a country. And you know, that's kind of an impossible situation you put these people. Consequently, you got a lot of answers that were hedging, yes, no, no, yes, some of them absolutely no, no. The problem, too, the emotional reactions from that particular questionnaire, many people, as a form of protest, answered no, no, send me to Tule Lake, the segregation camp, and they'll defy the United States. It was a very unfortunate affair, because I still believe that you don't measure loyalty by answering a questionnaire. There are many ways in which you demonstrate your loyalty, and certainly it's a matter of the heart and mind that you cannot determine purely by a questionnaire.
In order to prove their loyalty, some Japanese American men did so with their blood. Many of these men served in the 442nd Combat Team, composed of the A Battalion, B Battalion, and the 100th Infantry.
The 100th Infantry came from Hawaii, and in 1943, when they were recruiting for the 442nd, they asked for 1,500 volunteers out of the camps, and they got them. 1,500 men volunteered to clear out of the camps. We had lawyers, doctors, dentists, engineers, all kinds of older men over the age of 18 who volunteered for the 442nd. Consequently, they're probably the best educated outfit in the United States Army on an average. They also asked 1,500 volunteers to come from Hawaii, and 15,000 young men volunteered in Hawaii because they hadn't gone through the same kind of experience. They fought in Europe, of course, and they covered themselves with glory. They got 21,000 decorations, 9,648 Purple Hearts. You can go on forever. They had 7 presidential unit citations. They covered themselves with glory. They have the most outstanding military record of any military unit in the United States Armed Forces. But the story that was not told then, and still not fully understood, is that the military also recruited intelligence officers. They were sent to the Camp Savage in Minnesota for the military intelligence to interpret and translate Japanese documents. During the war, 6,000 men of Japanese ancestry were sent to the Pacific Theater of Operations, island hopping in the South Pacific, went into the China, Burma, India theater. They performed the interrogation. They were intercepting radio messages. They went into the caves of Saipan and talked the Japanese soldiers into surrendering. They did a tremendous job. General Willoughby, who was the aide-de-camp for General MacArthur on this intelligence, said that, you know, the Japanese-American soldiers undoubtedly shortened the war by at least 2 years and unquestionably saved at least 1 million American soldier lives. That was the kind of contribution. If you look at the record of the Japanese-American over the World War II period, 33,000 Japanese-Americans from Hawaii and the mainland of the United States served in the armed forces of the United States. I might point out that's the highest ratio of any racial group in the United States.
Many of the internees are waiting for the U.S. government to admit it was wrong, to admit it made a mistake. Yasui wants redress.
I think the program for redress started in the 40s. The moment it's happened, many of us says, look, we can't contest it openly by physical violence or physical resistance, but we'll reserve the question in law. And indeed, we've done that. In 1946, of course, we started the Evacuation Claims Act. Then most of us got married, had kids, busy raising a family, and so on. So it's not until 1970, 72, when the National Japanese American Citizens League began to pass resolutions saying that after all the constitutional guarantees of these people were violated, we certainly ought to bring it to the attention of Congress and the American people, because it's a dangerous thing to allow to have happened, because if it happens to us, it could happen to everyone else. It was not really until our third generation, the sons say the young people, ages in the late 20s, early 30s, really took a hold of this movement. And I suppose you'd have to say that's a result of the civil rights revolution, if you call it that, back in the late 1960s, that motivated our young people to insist that redress should be a major issue. It's a two-pronged effort. We are in the Congress of the United States, and certainly we have legislation before the Congress of the United States at the present time, House Bill 442, in the Senate, Senate Bill 1053. We're trying to get the Congress, of course, to consider this. It follows the recommendation of the Commission saying a trust fund of $1.5 billion should be established, from which 60,000 present survivors should be paid the sum of $20,000 each. Now, 20,000 times 60,000 people amounts to $1.2 billion, which would be paid out of this fund, which leaves $300 million. The $300 million is, according to the Commission, supposedly to be used for educational purposes, research, for humanitarian purposes, and indeed for community projects. I always add that really we ought to use such a fund as a memorial for the men who died in the 442, as a memorial for our parents, to protect the human rights of all people. And I think that would be a fitting memorial. In the judicial front, the young people in San Francisco, particularly Dale Minami, a young man by the name of Don Tamaki, Miss Wong, Richard Leung in Seattle, Kathy Bunai, young people again undertook to overturn the United States Supreme Court cases in the Korematsu Mai case and Hirabayashi case. They've spent enormous time and effort and energy in preparing these cases so that in the Korematsu case, as of November 10, 1984, they were successful. I've received assistance from Peggy Nagai and a group of attorneys in Portland, Oregon, all working pro bono without fees. And we are proceeding through the Circuit Court of Appeals in Oregon. In the Hirabayashi case, again, we have Richard Leung, Young Suzuki, certainly volunteer attorneys that's working on the Hirabayashi case. So there's been a rejuvenation of interest. And the motivation, again, is a sense of gratitude for their parents, their grandparents who contributed to their lives as well as to America. But most importantly, you know, they say to us, we're rewriting American history, we're correcting American history, we're making America subscribe a little bit more closely to the ideals expressed. So, you know, it's a wonderful motivation. They've done a tremendous job, and we're very deeply grateful to these young people.
After more than 40 years, many of the Japanese American internees are just now beginning to talk about the camp experience, to release a lifetime's worth of pent-up feelings. But others, like Yasui, have been carrying on the battle for most of their lives.
Many of us have been carrying on this battle for a long time. Mike Masaoka is one of the first individuals, and people have thrown rocks at Mike Masaoka, but Saburo Kido, Larry Tajiri, many of us old-timers have been working on this for 40 years. It is true that the popular support came because of the stimulus of the young people. Let me also comment about what you're talking about. People keep things pent up. It is generally true among the Asian American population. You don't expose your feelings because then you're exposing your weaknesses to the outside world, so it is not generally done. But there are among us, fortunately, individuals who will speak out and who refuse to be suppressed. So What you are saying is partially and to a large part true, but there is also the other aspect that leadership has continually insisted upon full restitution. You can never repay the debts you owe to your grandfather, grandmother, parents, but you at least try to justify their sacrifices by doing something good. I keep remembering what my dad kept saying, that, you know, you're on this earth, planet Earth, to make it a little bit better for your having been here. Now, that kind of a philosophy, I think, it motivates many of the Japanese-American population that is now working.
What would Yasui like to see, redress-wise?
Frankly, I'd like to see a recognition by the Congress of the United States formally and officially saying that the evacuation was indeed a mistake, that there would be a significant amount of money put aside as a trust fund in order to promote humanitarian efforts of all people. From the standpoint of history, I think I'd like to have the American people realize that when you subjugate, when you suppress or oppress any group of people, you are really derogating the rights of all people. Because if you can do it to the least of us, then you can indeed do it to all of us. And it is not in our advantage. If there is suffering or pain that is unfairly imposed upon anyone, it's my duty, it's your duty to try to alleviate it, because that's the way in which we gain a better life for all of us. And I go back to the fundamental rights of all American citizens. I should be just as eager to defend your rights as I am my own, because your rights impinges upon mine. If they take away your rights, they could take away mine. So I will fight to preserve yours. And I hope that kind of a message will eventually come out of this whole redress process.